reports this afternoon that the ANC's top leadership, its top 7 officials, are still discussing coalition options. News 24 has reported that, in fact, a National Executive Committee meeting that was planned for today will now only be held later in the week. Still no clarity on which way the ANC will go, whether it will work with the MK or the EFF or the DA or the IFP. At the same time, various proposals being put forward about how a coalition in national government and how coalitions in provincial governments could actually work. Pranish Desai is a data analyst at Good Governance Africa. He's one of these people who spent an awful lot of time working out how coalitions could work. Pranish, good afternoon and thank you for your time. Firstly, we've never been here before. Made the point, we're going to get bored of saying uncharted territory. It's a very confusing time. Are there particular principles that could guide political parties through this confusion?
Thanks, Stephen. It's great to be back and back with your viewers as well. I think there certainly are some principles, and specifically those that are in line with our constitutional framework. So, the preamble to the Constitution makes it very clear that some of the founding values of South Africa, a democratic South Africa, are transparency, responsiveness, and accountability. So in that vein, I think that one thing that political parties need to start doing more, and society needs to start pressurizing them more on, is trying to make any pacts that they have struck privately publicly available and transparent. There's no legally binding mechanism for that right now. The Department of Cooperative Governance have recently released a bill that concerns the local level, but there's no current legislative framework, and so it would require quite a bit of society using its power over political parties to try and make this happen. Beyond that, there are a number of other principles to follow, but one of the key long-term ones is that South Africa fundamentally needs a civil service that is capable of continuing even in the face of political uncertainty. People at home need their clean water and safe drinking water, regardless of whether the president or the mayor is facing a vote of no confidence that very same day.
So you're talking about depoliticizing the civil service. It's a vital thing, very hard to do.
No, it is very hard. But, this whole area, I think, is going to be very hard initially. But there's also ultimately what voters have decided upon. And so, society is simply going to have to learn how to navigate these challenges. Coalitions are implicitly built into our constitutional framework. It's specifically a provision around the concept of proportionality, which roughly means that if you get 5% of the vote, you'd expect to get roughly 5% of representation. Now, globally, political scientists have seen that these proportional systems tend to produce coalitions more frequently. And one reason is one that's pretty obvious to any South African voter. These systems can encourage party fragmentation, especially in really diverse societies. And South Africa is a classic example of that. We had that liberation movement running the country for 30 years, and South Africans have now decided to sort of go with the iron law of proportionality, you might say.
I just want to pick up on this point about what you say about us being a diverse society. Of course, that's incredibly correct. And it makes me wonder about the very structure of our society, that everyone talks about coalitions in other places. And I want to keep reiterating this point, that yes, Germany and Denmark and Belgium and Switzerland and all of these other places with a lot more experience in coalitions are also much more, the sort of big word is homogenous societies. We are a very unequal society, the most unequal society in the world. That's racialized. And that presumably means structurally, never mind the personalities of, Cyril Ramaphosa and Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema and John Steenhuisen or whoever it is, that actually structurally it's much harder to strike a deal in South Africa than it would be almost anywhere else.
No, yeah, it certainly is, and that's a great point, because the examples that we are often having to cite are Germany and Denmark and Finland. And, ultimately these are homogenous societies. And also they have political cultures that are ultimately more attuned with the idea of coalitions, in that they haven't had majority parties or dominance for a very long time. And they have, I think fundamentally political cultures where the politics of consensus building is more ingrained. Fortunately, in South Africa's case, or I guess unfortunately because this culture clearly no longer exists, we do have that precedent of the GNU, which was a coalition not born out of, say, electoral necessity, but one out of that was born out of political necessity. It was ultimately a compromise. And what I'd hope that political party leaders now look at when they look at the GNU is the fact that you had leaders and parties that were quite literally killing each other the years before that transition, in any direction really, working together actually for what is probably the most successful period in our democratic history. that 5-year period, even if the National Party left, they were actually politically punished for leaving, I'd say. And that's another reason why, the reason for making agreements transparent is so that might disincentivize the idea that you can renege on an agreement that you've made behind closed doors. So society really does need to, flex its muscles here as well.
It's interesting. I mean, you make the point that there's no way to force those agreements into the public domain. I mean, we live in a society where a court has ruled that a political party's cadre deployment committee's records must be made public. I mean, it may well be that, in fact, there is a legal mechanism to do it. And it only needs to happen once, doesn't it?
Yes.
And then after that, all the agreements would almost de facto be public.
Now, I would certainly encourage public-minded lawyers to see if there are these sorts of mechanisms. I'm not a lawyer myself, but what I will say is that really we do need these various institutional arms, and people are responsible for making those institutional arms work to make sure that we can make this coalitions era lead to an era wherein we can slash these high levels of unemployment. The economic growth numbers that came out today, we're stagnant, and we haven't even considered the prospect of potential election reruns. How might that impact the economy? And all that really highlights is why you need to be able to use any mechanism that is available to you to ensure that this coalitions era is as stable and accountable as possible.
Look, it's kind of a national sport to be rude about our politicians, and I understand that and occasionally take part. But isn't there also a factor about how difficult this is, never mind just the structure? It's really hard for the ANC to work with the DA because it's the workers' party in a way, being forced to work with the employer. It's really hard for the ANC to work with MK because Jacob Zuma literally betrayed the ANC, sitting in his NEC meetings. Julius Malema has his own history with Cyril Ramaphosa. So to get around any of those kinds of problems, and at least one of those problems has to be gotten around, it has to be gotten around somehow, it's actually very difficult. And this is also a consequence of the fact that the ANC is the biggest party. You can't really form a government without it. I certainly can't see MK and the DA working together, or not for more than 5 minutes. And so what that means is that the politics of the moment is probably far harder than in many other political situations that I can even dream of.
No, I certainly don't envy the political party leaders. What I will say there is, on that point of political culture I was making earlier, it applies to party members, the branches, the lower down structures in other parties, just as much as it does to the leaders. They all need to get used to this reality where no party can claim an outright mandate. And they need to figure out, that does mean that some principles that they've held very strongly for decades now might actually have to be watered down slightly or abandoned. And that's a very painful realization, I think, especially in the case of the ANC as a party that's been in power. But it's a realization they'll ultimately probably have to make in whatever direction they end up going in, for the sake of the nation's stability.
It seems to me, and call me a cynic if you like, Pranish, there may be some political parties who think actually it would be far more fun, far more a demonstration of their power to refuse to take part in any coalition. It may also just be impossible for maybe the ANC to come to a decision that's not too costly internally for its leadership. That in fact, the 14 days will come, and on the 14th day, we'll all look to Parliament, and is the Chief Justice going to call a meeting? And he maybe calls a meeting, but they're not able to elect a president. Or if they do, it's the ANC MPs electing Cyril Ramaphosa. They have the most seats in the National Assembly. But there's actually no deal at all on the table. Or do you think that the fear of civil society and of voters will actually force parties to the table in some way?
So I think on balance, I would anticipate that there's a president elected within this 14-day period. The point here is, again, another place where we need to re-examine our laws. Is 14 days really sufficient? Because that's, it's standardized. It's at the local municipal council level, which we've seen has ended not too well, since 2016 and 2021. It's at the provincial level with premiers, and it's at the national level with the president. So our system of laws, so long as we can make it through this quite nervy 2-week period, will need to come under greater examination, and I'd hope that if this parliament does constitute properly, that it makes it an active priority and civil society and citizens hold that parliament to account to make sure that we do re-examine these things, because coalitions are here to stay and we need to find a way to make them work and make our system of laws as consistent with the idea of making them work as possible.
You refer to the Government of National Unity as a precedent, and I'm intrigued by that for a few reasons. One is it's 30 years ago. I'm old enough to remember it. And the thing that I find fascinating by this is that decisions made now could be how all coalition negotiations are held in the future. The first time you do something, the first time you learn to drive, you often drive, and that way it becomes a habit very quickly. We'll have elections again in 5 years' time. We'll have elections in local government in just 2 to 3 years. What I'm trying to get to is, could these coalition negotiations, this period, actually be almost the most important defining time for coalitions for the next 30 or 50 years?
Yeah, I certainly think it has the potential to, subject to the sorts of decisions that are made now. Politicians and political parties more broadly do have this opportunity to try and demonstrate to the public that they can reconcile certain things, simply for the idea of making sure that governance works on a day-to-day basis. That is essential. They have this opportunity. Whether they choose to take it is up for debate. But they do also need to recognize that this is a pivotal historic moment. Potentially, they'll be etching their own names if they make a success out of this in the history books. And so, hopefully that's an incentive for some of them at least to, try and make it work as much as possible. Subject to them not doing so, it then does fall ultimately up to citizens and voters. We are a democracy. Despite the lower rates of participation, we are a democracy fundamentally, and citizens do need to get more and more active in this process if they want to see stable governance that can deal with some of their most pressing issues.
In my younger and more naive days, I had hoped that coalition governments would lead to less corruption, because what that would mean is if you have your great political rival in government with you, they will be able to see what you were doing. And that hasn't happened at all. As I grow older and more cynical, I realize what happens is that people team up to basically parcel out the patronage. And you made the point that there's no legal mechanism at this point to say that any agreement needs to be binding or actually publicly available at all. So what can civil society, what can people do to stop what would be the nightmare of just parties getting together and dividing up the patronage, dividing up the public works budget, for example?
So over the long term, one way they can do this is by getting more involved in these public consultation processes, which already do exist. Like, for example, that Department of Corporate Governance poll is currently up for public comment. That deadline only ends in a month's time. So I'd encourage all the viewers out there, if you do care about the future of coalitions, have a scan through it, look up any technical terms, and then potentially, give your comment to Parliament. Whether they listen to it or not, you've at least made that effort, and it's then up to you to keep holding them to account. In the shorter term, it is by learning more and more about coalitions, trying to pressurize the officials that you can actually directly pressurize in some way, to at least not pressurize them in terms of making a specific deal or not. Just pressurize them in terms of making sure that stability and stable governance is the core focal point in these negotiations. It's very easy, I think, for political parties in the aftermath of a pretty volatile election to go into sort of navel-gazing exercise. But it's quite important that they remember that there are millions of people out there who actually rely on their ability to pass budgets or enact new laws or deepen mechanisms of accountability in our democracy.
I think many people are scared right now, Pranish.
No, I'm sort of one of them, so I can sympathize with them.
Appreciate the honesty. Pranish Desai, thank you. Data analyst at Good Governance Africa. Do appreciate the time.